This broadcast of the Hamptons Institute at Guildhall is being brought to you by Bridgehampton National Bank.
Good afternoon. My name is Andy Rich. I'm the president of the Roosevelt Institute. The Roosevelt Institute is the partner with Guildhall in putting on the Hamptons Institute, and I want to thank all of you for coming out. Many of you were here for the first panel. This is the second panel of what will be a two-and-a-half-day event investigating arts and ideas and having real conversations that engage you with some of the leading figures in different sectors of our society. The Roosevelt Institute is an organization that's been around for quite a long time. We are connected to the legacy of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. We're the nonprofit partner to the FDR Presidential Library up in Hyde Park, New York. We're headquartered now in New York City, and alongside our partnership with the FDR Presidential Library, we're very committed to carrying forward the values and the spirit that Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt brought to the 20th century, doing it in kind of two substantial ways. One is that we have a network of campus-based student policy efforts around the country. On 120 campuses now, we have chapters of what's called the Roosevelt Campus Network. It is a student movement designed, developed, and led by students, 10,000 of them who call themselves members of the Roosevelt Campus Network, who are really developing ideas around the future that they want to inherit and really developing themselves as leaders for the next generation. And alongside that, we have, based in New York, something that we call the For Freedom Center, which is named after one of President Roosevelt's most famous speeches in 1941, where he called for these four freedoms around the world: freedom of speech and freedom of religion, and then freedom from want and freedom from fear. And we have been working since 2009 to engage particularly the questions around freedom from want. We started the For Freedom Center at the beginning of 2009 in the wake of the biggest financial collapse since the Great Depression and since President Roosevelt took office. And with the help of senior fellows like Joe Stiglitz, Rob Johnson, Bo Cutter, Jeff Madrick, and a variety of others who are sort of at the intersection of practice and scholarship, we have sought to contribute to the public debate around how to rebalance the financial sector within the real economy and the economy within a system of democracy that creates the kind of society that we'd all like to live in. And for us, it was a distinct privilege about a year and a half ago to be approached by some of the folks here at Guildhall about putting on a program that is sort of like an Aspen Ideas Festival for the Hamptons, that really would bring a broad range of perspectives and a broad range of people to have conversations about some of the pressing issues of the day across all sectors. And the person who made really all of that possible from our end of things was Ellen Chesler, who is a fixture here in the Hamptons and they described her at the beginning of the last program as the program director, but she's really much more than that. She's a senior fellow with us and doing some fantastic work focused on the human rights legacy of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. She's a distinguished author of a book around Margaret Sanger, and she has put this together with a real passion for bringing to the Hamptons, a community that she loves, the opportunity for really deep conversation about and a whole variety of perspectives on some of the important subjects of the day. The panel we're about to begin is one that couldn't be more timely. We're sort of pivoting from what was, I thought, a fantastic first discussion around the arts and the art of producing to one that is in the headlines every day, 24 hours a day right now, which is the questions around the debt, questions around jobs, and questions around China. What we have framed as the title of the panel, America's Three Financial Challenges. And we have three fantastic folks to provide perspectives and to begin the discussion on this. Byron Wien, who's the vice chairman of Blackstone Advisory Partner, is going to be the moderator of the discussion. Jared Bernstein, who just left the administration, who was the chief economic advisor to Vice President Biden, now is a senior fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and Zachary Karabell, who's the president of River Twice. And before I turn it over to them, I just want to thank Guildhall for being such a fantastic partner for us, and Mickey Strauss in particular, and Ruth Appelhoff, the Tarr family, and Chubb Insurance for making this partnership possible. And I hope you enjoy the next panel.
I can't believe that you all took part of the day off. It's probably the best day we've had out here. And it's unbelievable that anybody would give up any part of it, even that I would give up any part of it. But here we all are, and we're going to try to seriously treat 3 issues. We're going to start out with each person expressing his views on the 3 issues that are the subject of this panel. Each one will talk for 5 to 10 minutes. I will talk for 5 to 10 minutes, even though I'm the moderator, and then we'll try to drill down on some of the more controversial aspects of the issues that we're facing. So let's start with you, Jared. How do you view jobs, debt, and China?
Well, thank you very much. I can't tell you how happy I am to be out here. I live in the Beltway, work in the Beltway, and I really like to take every chance I can to get out of the Beltway. Although I must say the last place I went before I came here was to the Aspen Ideas Festival. So between Aspen and East Hampton, I'm not sure I'm quite making it to the heartland yet, but I'm having some great conferences. Thank you, Byron. I'm going to try to give you my theory of debt, jobs, and China in under 10 minutes. So I'm going to leave a lot of T's uncrossed and I's undotted. But let me go forth and I guess we'll do our exposition and then talk to you folks. You don't really learn what's wrong with an economy until you hit a bump, and we hit more than a bump. We hit a wall back in 2007, and that's when I think you can really get under the hood and figure out what's wrong. And a lot went wrong with what I think is aptly labeled the Great Recession. I have a number of candidates, some of which will be familiar to you in terms of the anatomy of that meltdown, all of which have to do with debt, jobs, and China. The first, which is partly a job story, has to do with this issue of increased income or wage or wealth inequality. Productivity actually grew quite handily throughout the business cycle of the 2000s. We were as productive a nation as ever, yet incomes of middle-class families fell behind inflation. They didn't just fall behind productivity growth, they fell behind inflation. They actually, well, they were basically flat in real terms. And that was the first time that's ever happened in any business cycle expansion going back to when the data began in the late 1940s. So one of the first building blocks that came loose was the split between productivity and the income of the middle class. Poverty rates were actually higher at the end of the 2000 business cycle than they were at the beginning. Now, over a business cycle, you expect as the economy expands, unemployment declines, you expect poverty to go down. That didn't happen. It actually went up. Critically important, risk was significantly underpriced. If you wanted to sum up the meltdown of the late 2007s in 2 words, I'd probably, if you forced me to do it in 2 words, I'd probably say underpriced risk. That is, if we were having a Twitter conversation, that's probably how I'd say it. That had to do a lot with some very shoddy underwriting practices in terms of mortgage loans, led to a housing bubble, some new origination practices, securitization. I think this story is probably well known, certainly to the people on this panel, I suspect to the audience as well. But the underpricing of risk was the second problem I wanted to note. A very bad fiscal policy, which brings us right to the issue of debt. Fiscal policy, let me summarize it this way. If you look at the factors that are driving the increase in deficits over, say, this decade, say 2010 to 2020, if you look at the factors that are driving the increase in the budget deficit that we are all so wound up about these days, and remember, I live in Washington, and I'm telling you, that is the 24/7 issue right now. Without question, the 2 factors that are most responsible in order are the Bush tax cuts and the wars, both of which were put on the credit card. So bad fiscal policy. deep leverage, again, sticking with debt. It wasn't just that the government got leveraged, it was leverage in all sectors, banks, households, businesses. Over-leverage, so what do I mean by over-leverage? Because leverage is actually a very important and useful part of a capitalist economy. Over-leverage, well, that depends, that's when your ability to become unlevered, your ability to sustain your debt, is dependent on an asset appreciating and continuously appreciating in ways that are historically anomalous, i.e. a bubble. That is, one of my definitions of over-leverage is when conditions that support that leverage are bubbly. And certainly, one of the ways that people, especially middle-class people in a climate where incomes were flat, could keep their living standards rising, the labor market wasn't doing it, jobs were very weak, was by borrowing on very favorable terms with, again, lousy underwriting and underpriced risk. And that was supported by a housing bubble. And when that bubble burst, you know what happened. Where's China in all of this? Obviously, China played an important role in supporting that leverage, buying hundreds and hundreds of billions of treasury bills. But what I'm going to focus on more in my comments, and I'm going to wind down soon, turn things over to my colleagues here, and so I'll probably come back to this during the discussion, is not just the fact that China financed so much of our debt, but that there was a mercantilist function embedded in that. The Chinese government, in order to make sure that its export share was growing and to insulate its economy from other countries' exports, made sure through currency management in exchange markets, made sure that the RMB, or the yuan, was kept at a low level relative to the dollar. It's called a currency peg. And if you ever want to see it, by the way, I have a blog, jaredbernsteinblog.com, and the other day I put up a post. And it was to me, it was an interesting post. It's very simple. It's one of these graphs that takes a minute to make, and I thought it was revealing. It just plots the yuan relative to the dollar and the euro relative to the dollar. And one of them goes really straight, then it adjusts a little bit, and then it goes really straight, and that's the yuan. That's the sign of a peg. And the other one bips and bops around the way you'd expect a currency. So that mercantilism both made sure dollars were flowing into China, and those dollars were coming back to support federal budget deficits. At the same time, while all of this was going on, the leverage, the financial activities were supported by financial instruments that were poorly understood by certainly regulators, and perhaps even poorly understood by lots of the people who were using them and trading them. The impact of all of this when it came to bust is well known, the Great Recession, and I can talk for days about that. I was kind of at ground zero, at least in terms of the Obama administration. When we took office in January of 2009, we were losing employment at a rate at which I'd never seen. 750,000 jobs a month, over 2 million jobs lost in the first quarter of 2009. This was a truly devastating moment with the economy really headed for a cliff. How that was dealt with and is being dealt with is another story for another day, but we're deep into a deleveraging cycle, and it's one of the reasons it's taking us so long to recover. Bad fiscal policy is still haunting us, and mercantilism is still afoot. I think in conclusion of my opening comments, let me try to tie these points together. The topic is debt, jobs, and China. When job growth is weak and the benefits of growth are poorly distributed, it's very tough for most families to get ahead. They're simply not facing the earnings and the income opportunities that they have historically faced in the job market. Middle-class families have been squeezed now for decades, and it was particularly tough in the 2000s. The only way they could get ahead was to borrow on favorable terms and cross their fingers and hope that this asset bubble was going to keep inflating, and ultimately gravity asserted itself, and the over-leveraged debt house of cards toppled over. So, first linkage. jobs, weak growth, not nearly enough to support families, debt flowing extremely freely, both due to poor oversight, bad underwriting, and this mercantilistic relationship with China. Lousy fiscal policy, such that when you hit the recession, you were stuck with budget deficits of the type that has our government wrapped up in knots right now. And underlying the whole thing, a mercantilistic strategy by not just China, but by emerging Asian economies who manage their currency in such a way. And by the way, I am not a China basher by any stretch of the imagination. I think I understand the motivation, and if you see me around, you'll see I have 2 kids adopted from China. So this weekend, so I happen to be very personally close to the country as well. And there's a lot of very positive things to say about China. But one thing that China contributes to this problem that I'm trying to connect for you is by managing their currency peg, keeping it low relative to the dollar. That both hurts our ability to grow out of the downturn that we're in, because it suppresses our exports and increases their imports. What little demand we can generate is being absorbed by China right now, and it has for at least a decade now supported an over-leveraging at many different levels of government. I'll stop there.
2 kids from China. Your next book should be Battle Hymn of a Tiger Father. So I'm going to take a somewhat different tack. I mean, there's certainly a lot that I agree in as kind of analytically in what Jared's talking about, but there's also a lot that I don't. So let's just do 3 little bullet points about jobs, debt, and China. First, on debt, we don't have a debt crisis. We're having a crisis over debt. Secondly, on jobs are not, and unemployment rates are not a cyclical phenomenon. They are not simply a product, unemployment is not simply a product of a financial crisis and its aftermath, whereby the script of the 20th century in the United States, which saw jobs creation flowing on the heels of economic recovery, after that script is not the script of the 21st century, and that for the first time in generations, if indeed the first time ever, the United States is facing an issue of structural unemployment, structural underemployment, and a vastly changing economic landscape. And finally, on China, thank God for China, because it's the real driver of a global economic system. And for all the talk of whether or not there's systems are coupled or uncoupled that people were debating years ago, the effect of China as a driver of global economic activity, while hugely disruptive to the system of the 20th century, has been a source of stability and vibrancy, including for the domestic American economy, in a way that is almost completely at odds with how we tend to see these things optically, because we are focused more on the relative change of power of the United States relative to our memories, relative to our experience, and not to a system that is in many ways being anchored by the dual activities of the United States and China in what I think is more or less a synchronistic and symbiotic system, which none of us particularly like and none of us particularly want, but which exists nonetheless. So on the first thing about debt, and we're not having a debt crisis, we're having a crisis over debt. What I mean by that is, and this is something that we should have seen coming. There was an election, as many of us remember, in the fall of 2010 that saw a massive shift of power in the House of Representatives from Democrats who were to some degree on the same page as the president about what was needed to be done in the country, although not nearly, and I'm sure Jared understands this much more intimately than I ever will, not nearly as much on the same page as could have been or should have been, and a sea change where a certain kind of populist movement represented by the Tea Party, but also embedded in a lot of the Republican Party, which perceives the accumulation of debt and capital as a destructive force in American life, much the way populist movements in the United States have perceived capital accumulations or the misuse of capital as being, part of the way the American heartland is being destroyed. It's an old story with a new chapter. So the fact that this was going to become an issue shouldn't be a surprise, but I think in many ways the markets are treating it as a surprise, and there's a degree of Peter Lorre-esque gasping about gambling in Casablanca. Oh my God, the Tea Party candidates are making an issue out of debt, when in fact the only thing that any of them were elected on was making an issue out of debt. So at least to their credit, they, unlike many political forces, have been absolutely true to their campaign promises and have done precisely what they said they were going to do. That being said, there is no structural shift. That we have not reached a tipping point globally. And the only way I can say this with any level of confidence is that interest rates have not spiked, gold is not $10,000 an ounce, the world is not battening down the hatches, and the US credit rating is only being imperiled because of the crisis that we are creating around debt, not because of the structural amount of debt. And the amount of debt that the United States government currently has relative to interest rates and relative to the amount that it costs us to service that debt is lower than at any point since the late 1970s, with the one exception of 2004 and 2005, when the amount that it cost to service the federal debt was 1.5% of GDP, which is about where it is now. Which means we should have been absolutely apocalyptically hysterical throughout the 1980s and 1990s, which I'm sure some of us were for reasons having nothing to do with fiscal balance, and that our current hysteria is a product of an ideological sense of where are American strengths versus weaknesses. It certainly is a different thing psychologically to be a debtor than a creditor, rather than any kind of fiscal crisis that is immediate and of the moment. The job issue is a different one, and while these have become linked in our public discussion, that somehow the levels of spending are depressing the ability to create employment, I think that is a completely vacuous link. It is a non-existent link except in the ability of those to make it rhetorically, to make it sound as if it's real. And there is no evidence/connection between our inability to create jobs and our levels of debt, insofar as we are living in a capital system, both in the United States and globally, that is more flush with cash than has typically been true at any point in the past years. Whether that's corporate balance sheets, whether it's global capital, whether it's the cost of capital. The fact is, jobs are not being created in this country, in my view, because most of the jobs that would have been created are simply not necessary for companies that are making money to create. And what that means is that we don't really live in this thing called the economy. There is no the economy. There are multiple economies, some of which are contiguous with national borders, and many of which are not, and float into this amorphous but emerging global system. And some aspects of our economies are job creating and are thriving. There are at least 2 meaningful jobs reports every single month, or at least every quarter, that we need to be paying attention to. And one we pay attention to with laser-like focus, which is the Bureau of Labor Statistics job report every month that quantitatively tries to create this very round statistic of unemployment and its rate. And it's a very problematic number, but it does tell you something directionally. The other is the Steve Jobs report. When Steve Jobs gets up every quarter for Apple Computers and makes an announcement about how many iPhones and iPads and iTouches and iEverythings that have been sold. And for every period of time that the United States has been shedding jobs for the past 2 years, that jobs report has been going down and the other jobs report has been going up. And they're both real. You know, it's not an argument about which is more real, but they speak to very different aspects of our economies. And what it says is that unemployment and underemployment in this country, which is massive, I mean, not 14 million unemployed, it's got to be in the range of 25 to 30 million plus when you add in poverty wages for actual employment, and then another 30 or 40 million when you add in the people who are barely making do with the wages that are not moving. So we live in very different economies, and we need, I think, to deal with the structural realities that there's a large set of people in the United States, many of whom were tied toward heavy industry and manufacturing, whose skill set and or jobs relative to technology and to China and to the world are simply no longer needed within the world that we're in. And acting like we have this national jobs emergency rather than a particular one doesn't do us any good. Finally, on China, again, I don't see the linkages in the mercantilist, depressing of the value of Chinese goods, or, I mean, I understand the economic argument for it. I just don't actually think it's playing out that way. First of all, in China, mercantilism, all countries are mercantilist. I would challenge anyone to find this thing called an altruistic country that pursues the goods of the many rather than the needs of their particular. Chinese, Beijing zealously, monomaniacally pursues its own self-interest, as does Washington when it is able to focus on anything The only difference between Beijing and Washington seems to be that Washington is afflicted with ADD, and there is no collective Ritalin, and Beijing is able to focus. But the notion that the Chinese are kind of pulling the strings, I think, misses the fact, and this is interesting with the debt ceiling looming, is that one of the countries that will suffer the most if we actually do create and induce a debt crisis in the United States is China. Because while it's true that we are indebted to China, at least at the level of $1 trillion of direct holdings of treasuries, and Chinese investments in the United States in the form of indirect holdings of assets are multiples greater, probably more than that $3 trillion in reserves. They need the stability of the U.S. economic system as well as the continued activity of American companies in China in order to fuel that domestic system that has been working so well. And these things are best seen as two uncomfortable halves of a whole than two systems in opposition. So I don't know where that leaves us other than to say that I think the world that we're actually living in is both more complex, different, and doesn't follow the rules and laws of the world that we had been living in. And that the particular issues that we're facing are going to require a kind of nimbleness and creativity that isn't going to be well served by relying on the wisdom of the 20th century to get us there. And whether it's treating our national system as a closed system and unemployment as a cyclical phenomenon, or whether it's treating China as an economic adversary because it's another nation, I think none of those frameworks are going to get us to where we need to get to.
Well, Zachary, I found myself in disagreement with almost everything you said until the very last statement, which I really do agree with.
I take it back.
Let me start out by saying that the one place where I think you and I do agree quite strongly is the future is going to be very different from the past. And people who think that we're going to revert to the mean and it's just a question of time, those people are going to be sadly disappointed. Let me talk about what I think are the big ideas that really surround the topics that we're confronted with this afternoon. Let's start with China. Let's look at where China was under Mao. China was a feudal society under Mao. He died in 1976. Deng Xiaoping took over. He spent 2 years, he did not shoot from the hip. He spent 2 years developing reforms. In 1978, he began a series of reforms that transformed China over the next 30 years. China made more progress during that 30-year period than any country in the history of the world. Now, they couldn't have done this if they were a democracy. They could have only done it if they were an authoritarian government. By 1995, China represented 2.5% of world GDP. Today, they represent 9.4% of world GDP. They are the second largest economy in the world. Now, part of the reason that they're there is because they have kept their currency undervalued. That has been a very clear part of Chinese economic policy. It isn't, something that we can influence them to do. Their goal is to take 25 million people out of the countryside and put them to work in industrial cities and therefore raise their standard of living. And the standard of living in China, for any of you who have been there, has risen enormously. China probably, arguably, has the best infrastructure in the world today. Certainly in Shanghai and Beijing they do. But I've been there 5 times in the last 18 months, and I can tell you in smaller cities, the infrastructure is moving forward. They can do that because they have the resources to do it, and our infrastructure is falling behind. So China is indicative of something that we in America have to face up to, and that is that there are 7 billion people in the world, and only 1 billion of them live in developed countries, in the United States, Europe, Japan, Australia, Canada, etc. 6 billion of them live in the developing world, and those developing countries are raising their standard of living every year, whereas our standard of living is flattening or going down. So that is the first of the big ideas, and facing up to it is really key. The second point I want to make is on the debt problem and how we got into it. It seems to me that probably the worst idea in my business career that we've had is the idea of the ownership society. Back in the 1990s, during the Clinton administration, and this is one idea that has been carried through from administration to administration, it became clear that a great idea was for every American to own his or her own home. The way to accomplish that is to make borrowing simple for mortgages and ultimately cheap. In 2000, Alan Greenspan, whom I view as the victim of this, or the person who perpetrated this concept most vigorously. In 2000, Alan Greenspan became spooked by the idea that the entire Western civilization was going to close down when we went from 1999 to 2000. And he kept interest rates low to accommodate a possible slowdown in the economy. Then we had the World Trade Center attacks, and interest rates were also kept low. The ownership society really took hold under the Bush administration, and interest rates were kept arguably too low, and in addition to that, the Federal Reserve looked the other way when mortgage practices and financial institution and shadow financial institutions began to loan money to people who really shouldn't have been borrowing it. The concept, if you were an $80,000 a year earner and you could afford a $250,000 house, and you saw house prices rising 10% a year, what you did is go out and borrow on a $500,000 house, thinking if it appreciated 10% a year, three years from now you could flip that house and make a profit on it. A lot of people tried to do that, and it worked very well until 2007. The problems we got into, at least at the consumer level, during the financial crisis, the problems we got into were as a result of people borrowing on houses they couldn't afford and institutions loaning the money. Why did they do that? Because the loan officer whose compensation was tied to loan volume was compensated more generously if he wrote larger tickets. So at the consumer level, and ultimately because of the financial crash, at the federal level, we incurred too much debt. I do think we do have a debt problem. It took 200 years for the United States to accumulate $8 trillion in debt. It's only taken 6 years to go to $14 trillion in debt. We just can't continue to run debt at the present level. We're running a budget deficit today of $1.65 trillion. It's 10%, more than 10% of the gross domestic product. We've never run it in peacetime, anything like this. And not only that, but it's intractable. It doesn't look like we're going to bring it down anytime soon. What the deficit represents is an enormous stimulus to the economy. Think about it. If you have a $15 trillion economy and you cut $500 billion out of the deficit, you'd put us back into recession. So you can't do too much to cure this problem too quickly, or you'll create an economic calamity. And we don't have the tools to get out of it. Interest rates are already zero, and because of the composition of Congress now, we can't get any fiscal stimulus program. So why, Zachary makes the point that why worry about this? Interest rates are so low. When I go to Washington to talk to both appointed and elected officials about that, that's the argument they throw back at me. If this problem were as severe as I describe it, interest rates would be much higher. And in fact, I have thought they would be much higher. But they're not higher. Why? Because there's so much fear around the world. There's fear in China because of the housing bubble or the banking crisis, fear in Japan because of the problems caused by the nuclear reactor and the slowdown there, which is turning around, fears in the Middle East because of the Arab Spring, fears in Europe because of the credit crisis. So wealth is migrating to the United States because if you put $1 in here, you'll get $1 back. It may not buy as much, but at least you'll get it back. So the situation in the United States is that our interest rates are aberrationally low, even though our debt is aberrationally high. Maybe that'll go on forever. Certainly in Washington, they think it'll go on forever. But I'm worried that it won't go on forever. And when interest rates on Treasury securities start rising, that could be the wake-up call. Let me make a couple of comments on jobs, and then we'll have a conversation among the three of us. Historically, when the economy was strong, the unemployment rate would be about 5%. Then you'd go into a recession, it would go to 10, and then in the recovery, it would go back to 5. I don't know when, if ever, we're ever going to see 5% again. We, as people in India and China, live in a bifurcated society. There are 90% of the people are working. As Jared points out, a significant number of them have made no progress, probably in 20 years, in terms of their purchasing power. And that's the concept of the declining standard of living. A certain number of people who are working in jobs in industries that have too much capacity, like financial services, will probably never get jobs that pay anything like what they were paid before, and we have to face up to that. And a certain number of people will never be able to find work. If you think about it, college-educated people have an unemployment rate of 4.5%. The overall unemployment rate is 9.2%. If you're a teenager who didn't finish high school, your unemployment rate is probably 16%. And your prospects of getting a job are very small because the United States industrial establishment has worked very vigorously to operate more efficiently, which is why corporations are flush with cash and why corporate profits are so good. So we have a vast segment of the population that is going to have difficulty finding jobs. We have a slim portion of the population that is very wealthy. Some of them are probably sitting in this room. 1% of the US population controls 40% of the wealth and 25% of the income. And that's going to create, ultimately, in my judgment, a social problem and a political problem. In addition to that, we have a new structural issue, and that is that a lot of people are willing to work on a temporary basis, think they'll live forever, never have any health care problems. And so they're willing to forego retirement benefits. They're willing to forego health insurance in order to take the summer off and go to the beach, or the winter off and ski. And companies are very anxious to hire these people because the overhead burden is so small. So we have a very high percentage of jobs that are being held by temporary workers. These structural changes are a real impediment to the economy and change the nature of the whole employment picture and outlook. And that's something that I think is secular, that's going to be with us for a very long time. So the unemployment rate will probably go into the 8s, and I think ultimately into the 7s, but I don't think it'll ever go back to 5. And if you want to think about this from a political standpoint, no incumbent president has ever been reelected when the unemployment rate has been higher than 7.2%. So I'm sure that Obama has that number under his pillow and he's thinking about it, but in fact, I don't know that it has to get to 7.2, but I think it definitely has to get into the 7s. So how are we going to get out of this mess? we're going to have to get out of it over a long period of time and very slowly. But I think we have to face up to the fact that we're under a lot of challenges now, and we're not doing enough to solve them. And unless Congress is able to function in a more harmonious way, I don't know how we'll do it. I do fault the Obama administration. I, like probably many of you, supported Obama both in terms of my vote and my money. And I think he set his priorities incorrectly. When he had control of Congress, he felt he was so committed to his health care program, he had to put that first. He squandered, and I've thought of that word advisedly, he squandered his political position to get health care through when he should have focused on jobs. Jobs were the critical issue facing the economy. He could have done much more than he did. Now he's not in a position to do anything about it. And he's fighting the Tea Party all the way in terms of making changes that would stimulate the economy. So let me stop there and see if I've raised some issues that some of the others you want to deal with.
Let me push back on you on debt a little. And we probably agree on jobs more than not. Not that I'm craving agreement. And I think Obama probably could have...
You don't look particularly insecure to me.
You don't know, really. An energy bill could have been much more job creative than a healthcare reform bill, but we can get to that. So on the debt issue, this is a familiar dialogue, right? Someone says, well, this isn't the issue we should be focusing on for the following reasons, and I've laid out some. And Byron comes back correctly from the other side, which is, well, this can't go on forever, and the argument that you shouldn't be worried about it because rates will be low is a silly one because it flies in the face of a reasonable expectation for the future. I mean, first of all, it's not a question of not being worried. It's a question of what's the primary concern and how does one best get to a stable future. If I said to you, Byron, and you just bought a $500,000 home, and I said to you, you can't do that. You're $500,000 in debt, and that's not sustainable because it's just too much money. The issue is, if you could buy the home now and you can afford it, no, you couldn't then endlessly keep buying more expensive homes. The argument is not that we can go into eternally larger amounts of debt. It's always the issue of, at what point is that amount deleterious to our ability to utilize whatever capital we have in the present productively?
Can I jump in to make a point on that? Here's where I think both of you are missing something key about the debt issue. Debt in and of itself, as I think Zachary is intimating, is not a bad thing. It's a matter of what you're incurring the debt for. And there's a big difference between debt on the household side and debt on the government side. There's no question in my mind that Byron is right if what you were intimating is that the fiscal path of the federal government is unsustainable. That is, if we continue to mismatch what we're taking in and what we're spending out, debt as a share of the economy will just rise year in and year out, and there's no way any economy has ever been able to sustain that, and ours won't either. But that's more an issue of exactly what we're arguing about right now, how we're going to balance what kind of budgetary agreements we can agree on, whether and what share revenues will be part of the package, all that nonsense that I do in my day job. Where I think Zachary's point is critical and underappreciated is it's a perfectly wonderful, important, and attribute of advanced capitalist economies that you can borrow and invest in productive activities that help you grow. Now, if you're squandering your debt on housing bubbles or dot-com bubbles, or for that matter, hugely inefficient health care, that's wasteful. But if you're investing your debt in projects that will return in productivity terms, which, by the way, the Chinese, I agree with Byron, are very good at, and we've lost our touch, that's very different. So debt in and of itself sounds bad to everyone. Here's where I think Zachary's point is so important. It's not. It's a matter of what you're using it for.
Okay, let's just go back. I mean, to the Chinese and the debt problem, because they are very closely related. The Chinese, after all, own more, they are the largest holder of Treasury securities. And they got there by making a devil's compact with the United States. I have visions of them in a kind of Faustian sense. They once, an American representative slit his wrist and a Chinese, and they exchanged blood, and the Chinese guy said, we're going to buy your bonds if you buy our goods. And the United States started to buy enormous quantities of Chinese goods. So the Chinese engaged in a vendor financing program. They financed our ability to live beyond our means. Why? Because it allowed China to revitalize their manufacturing establishment. Those 25 million people that came out of the agrarian economy in China came out to produce goods that were sold largely to the United States. And we incurred the debt and the Chinese bought it.
See, I would say they financed our ability to live within our means, because if you look at the amount of defaults on credit card rates, right, 92% of Americans are current on their credit cards, even at the height of the crisis in 2009. Jared will correct me because I'm sure he lived and breathed this. It was about 90%. So, I mean, let's call it 90% of Americans have been, throughout the worst of this financial crisis, current on their credit cards, and about 90% have been current on their mortgages. The foreclosure rate, has been somewhere in that rate. Now, in my view, if you can say about any quantity that 90% are X, then the statement that follows is that the vast majority of that quantity are also X. The vast majority of Americans have lived within their means, taken on debt they can afford, and spent wisely. There has been a fraction, for whatever reason, without any value judgment, that have been unable to do that, or I guess on some margin unwilling to do so. There is certainly a structural issue in the United States about, will the levels of growth for a very affluent society be commensurate with our dreams and expectations of growth going forward? And we could get into that as well. But I simply don't think it's true. If anything, the pact with the devil with the Chinese allowed for a standard of living that could otherwise not be maintained within a very affluent society, within a wage structure that people had come to expect.
Yeah, look, I have no problem with the individual. The individual acted very responsibly. Consumer installment debt was brought down. There was $1 trillion worth of home equity loans that was brought down to zero. The consumer acted responsibly. It's the government that didn't act responsibly. It's the federal debt that I'm worried about. That's the situation that I think is going to bring us down. Because let me finish. Sure. Because we know that the Chinese are getting a little uneasy about how much debt they hold. And in the case of QE2, 70% of the Treasury securities issued had to be bought by the Fed. We can't count on the Chinese being there at the table. And I've sat across the table with Chinese who say, maybe we own enough of these things. We're not going to stop buying, but maybe we'll buy fewer of them at a time when we're going to be issuing more of them. So the fact is that I don't like a foreign power having those cards in his hand. Look, the way the Chinese, I say when I meet with Chinese officials, God, you guys have done a great job. It's just amazing what you've done with your economy. They say, what are you talking about? We dominated the world economy for 17 of the past 20 centuries. We took a 300-year recess. We're going back to where we belong. I mean, believe me, that's what they believe in China. And when you go there, that's what you think maybe they're right.
So a couple of points. First of all, if you don't think that private sector borrowing was a huge component of the deepest recession, overborrowing and over-leveraging in the foreclosure crisis, which was very much a private sector phenomenon, then I'm really not sure where you've been, because it's the foreclosure rate, by the way, is way under 10%.
No, but at its height for 2009, there was in certain.
I think you may be, well, anyway, I mean, it's like saying, 90% of people are employed, so we must be okay. I mean, a 10% unemployment rate is pretty tragic. So, or more like what you were saying, probably closer to 15 or, certainly closer to 16 or 20 when you add in the underemployed. But, so there's no question in my mind that the over-leveraging that I described in my opening comments was a key factor in the downturn, and it was as much a private as a public sector phenomenon, and Chinese borrowing played a role in that. I agree with Byron on that point. And by the way, Zachary and I disagree on this idea of mercantilism, so let's define it, because it's got to be confusing I think we're using terms a little imprecisely. All I mean is when you manage your currency to capture export share. When you manage your currency to capture export, and by that measure, they've been mercantilist and we haven't, and I can show you the graph, as I mentioned, that would absolutely show this. Now, I totally agree, economies engage in all kinds of things in their foreign interest, and that's in their domestic interest that hurts our foreign competitors, but that's much too broad a stroke. Okay, now, here's where Byron continually makes a statement that I think is factually wrong. The standard of living is decreasing, you've said numerous times. When you look at the most broad indicators of the standard of living, and extracting from the recession, which is actually behind us now in GDP terms, this indicator is actually going up again. GDP per capita, real GDP per capita, not only continues to rise, has risen, but I'm sure it's going to keep rising. I think your pessimism about where America is headed in terms of its standard of living writ large is wrong. If you just take the amount of wealth the economy generates and you divide it by the population, that's going up and it's going to keep going up. The problem is one, and you alluded to this, the problem is one of where it's a distributional issue. It's where that wealth is being concentrated. So it's wrong to say the standard of living is collapsing. It's correct to say the benefits of growth are terribly skewed. It's also, in my view, wrong to say we're not going to have enough jobs to employ people. I worry about that, but I'm not as pessimistic as at least Byron. I'm not sure where Zachary is on that. If you look at the projections of where the jobs are going to be over the next 10 years, the problem is that for, say, non-college educated workers, those people whose unemployment rate is well above 4.5%. By the way, do you know what share of our workforce is non-college educated? People who don't have four-year college degrees? It's 70%. This is not a trivial group. And it is true that as the factory sector contracts and becomes more mechanized and driven by more robotics and more capital than labor intensive, those folks definitely are facing exactly the displacement that Byron mentioned. But here are the occupations that will create the most jobs over the next 10 years. And it may surprise you, because I think to listen to Byron and Zachary to some extent, you may not have picked this up. Cashiers, home health aides, security guards, waiters and waitresses, mid-level managers, health technicians. These are the jobs that are going to bring down the unemployment rate. But in the current, and here's where your standard of living point is exactly right, but you're focusing it much too broadly. It's a problem for the middle class. Those jobs, which in times hence were more likely to be high productivity, high value added jobs that afforded a middle class lifestyle, barely pay a living wage in some parts of this country. And that's a problem we have to solve.
You want to take a shot? Okay. Well,
it's like a three-ring boxing thing. I'm not exactly sure which side I'm supposed to be focusing on at any given time.
Jared, you've argued both sides of it. You've actually, I think, argued against yourself. You said that there's an enormous disparity in wealth. I mean, I'm not worried about people with houses in the Hamptons. Nothing much is going to happen to them. I'm worried about the 70% who aren't college educated. You go out to Silicon Valley, you drive up and down 101, you see on the chain link fences there, job openings. There are plenty of job openings in the United States, but the people in those companies tell me that they interview people, they get hundreds of resumes, but the people don't have the skills. So the biggest problem is this disparity of wealth. Sure, the standard of living is what you refer to for all the people. The rich have gotten richer over the last 20 years. The middle class has lost ground, and the poor are much worse. That's the essential fact. In 2007, I gave a talk in London. It was entitled "America has Peaked." I didn't dare give it in the United States. And I later wrote an op-ed piece for the Financial Times based on the principle. And I said that the standard of living in the United States had peaked and was going to be declining for all the reasons you said, because the middle class was losing ground to inflation, was not able to, its income was not keeping pace with it. In addition to that, a certain percentage of it were losing jobs and not able to find them. I said I wasn't too worried about it because I studied the economic history of England, and I decided that England peaked in 1912, and life was still pretty good in London. When I was done, a guy came up to the podium and said, "Mr. Wien, I've always wanted to meet you. I've been reading your stuff for 25 years. I flew here from Amsterdam, and I'm here to tell you Holland peaked in 1617, and life is still pretty good over there." So the point is that, that there is going to be a gradual erosion. Let me give you a couple of other facts.
You don't disagree with my GDP per capita?
No, but I don't think it's relevant.
Well,
Because the GDP per capita, I'm benefiting from it. I'm doing better. I'm in better shape today than I was 20 years ago. But, I'm worried about the millions of people who aren't in better shape. And that's the standard of living that's declining.
it's a distribution.
If you have a house on the water here, that you shouldn't have any sympathy for that person. Okay, but look, it's not going to get better. It's going to get worse because we've always been the cradle of innovation in the United States. Now, more and more patents are being filed by people in China and people in India, and and we can't count on the fact that the developing world is going to manufacture products that are created in the United States. So this is the most serious threat that the United States faces. If you go into laboratories in the great universities, you see a tremendous number of Asian faces. They used to stay in the United States and innovate here, but now they're going back. So we're going to lose our edge in innovation. So we're going to have a tough time moving forward. So that's what seriously bothers me.
And I think part of the problem is that there are, in my mind, there are kind of two forces that converged in the past years that create what is a much more muddied picture than it should be. There's a longer term trend, which is that a lot of these things in terms of economic growth, wages, leveling off in a very affluent society really began in the 1970s and was then kind of punctuated by at least two periods of not just financial bubbles, but cultural euphoria. One was the kind of birth of the telecommunications and internet revolution in the 1990s, which led people to believe that we had, that and the end of the Cold War, kind of found the perfect formula to wealth and happiness, and we promptly spent that euphoria dividend with 19 months talking about Oval Office oral sex. And then there was another bubble in the mid-2000s around housing. But I think there, too, it would be misreading that disconnect as a one of individuals over-leveraging and homeowners over-borrowing. And really, the crisis part of it was the financial service industry creating derivatives and financial instruments on it. Because if it had just been limited to $200 to $400 billion of housing stock or debt on that housing stock, it would have been a recession, it would have been an economic pullback. It was the $600 trillion of traded instruments in the form of derivatives that nearly...
That was on my list.
Right. No, so I think that's the focus. And so you have a kind of gradual stagnation
it's still there, Zachary.
And it is, but saying you have a gradual stagnation of an economic system relative to an American belief that we're just going to grow endlessly. I'm going to write a piece about what's wrong with the Japan scenario. You talk about the Dutch saying we peaked in 16 whatever, and life isn't so bad. If you can have a really stable, affluent society without massive civil unrest, where most material needs are met, albeit not as optimally as people want, that's about as good as human beings have ever done throughout history. But it's certainly not one that is comfortable with an American narrative. But the other thing that happened here was...
society there. It's totally different here. They went through a 12-year deflationary recession, and there wasn't a single riot in the streets. you couldn't go through a 12-month recession, deflationary recession in the United States without some group feeling they were especially deprived. Okay, look, we've talked long enough among ourselves, and you've all come here on a nice day, so let's try to deal with some of the issues that are on your mind. Are there microphones? Has there been a provision for microphones? No.
We can repeat the question.
Yeah, go ahead. This gentleman. There are no microphones.
Just shout it out.
Yeah.
Proudly.
Are there no microphones?
There are no microphones.
Okay.
We will repeat. We'll repeat the question. So if you
but
say
you
it loud
shout
enough
it
for
out.
us to hear it, we'll repeat it to the
we
audience.
have to hear it. Yeah.
Right.
The question is, in your discussion of capitalism and debt, nobody mentioned the war and what it's cost us. And I think 3 years ago, Joseph Stiglitz said that the war plus what it's going to cost us over the future to support the poor guys that fought it for energy is going to be something on the order of $3 trillion. Comment on that?
That's like that episode from Fawlty Towers when John Cleese says, "Don't mention the war."
I mean, let me.
Actually, you did mention.
Well,
the war.
yeah. I mean, I did mention the cost. I did mention the cost of the war as one of the two primary factors that's driving the budget deficit, and that's not the Stiglitz cost, by the way. Stiglitz correctly calculates, as you mentioned, the longer-term costs based on damage done, the tragic human damage, the replacing of lost resources. And the two factors driving the deficit, right, the increase in the deficit over the next 10 years, or budget window, as they say where I come from, are the Bush tax cuts and the wars. And never, you know, if you look back over our history, you will be hard-pressed to find a period when we engaged in that kind of military expansionism and massively cut taxes at the same time. Your question is well taken.
Yeah, and just one quick on that. I mean, U.S. debt was about 140% of GDP during World War II. In the 1960s, I think tax rates went up. So we've essentially been fighting wars not with the mobilization of World War II, but 10 years of substantial military conflict. And the expectation that some public debt would not go up because of that was, well, certainly never particularly reasonable.
Hey, I've got an interesting piece of, what's the right word? Inside baseball that you should pay attention to. Everybody in this room should. So we're having this big debt ceiling debate right now, and there's an agreement being made as we speak, fingers crossed, on a budget deal so that we don't breach the debt ceiling. One of the things I'm starting to hear about, and it's really very tricky, and I don't like it, is they want to achieve budgetary savings and say, well, we're going to save $100 billion a year by ending the wars. Now, you actually would say that's about what it's cost per year, taking aside the Stiglitz costs. That's about the outlay cost per year. That's, in Washington terms, that's in the baseline. That's baked in the cake. Those wars are drawing down. They're going to draw down. So for people talking now about new savings, from savings that are already in the baseline or baked in the cake or expected to come in anyway, is a real kind of double counting that I would urge everyone to, you know, keep their green eye shades on.
Look, Fred, the key thing is this, that of the total budget deficit, only 29% of the total budget, only 29% is discretionary items. 71% is defense, Social Security, Medicare, entitlements for the unemployed, et cetera. The part that, you know, the thing that really infuriates me about Washington is that they only want to deal with foreign aid, the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Education, et cetera. They only want to deal with these soft factors. You know, if I were king, and this is something I think about a lot, but if, I would raise the Social Security retirement age to 70 right away. Wouldn't affect you, wouldn't affect me. I would make some very severe changes in Medicare, and because there's so much corruption and gaming in the system. I would change the entitlement programs for the unemployed. I would take some of these sacrosanct areas, but you can't do that. One of the problems we have in our society is that Congress is reelected every 2 years, and you don't get reelected by taking something away from somebody. So if you attack, as we saw in the 26th District of New York, where a Republican ran on Tea Party principles and was going to cut Medicare, and a Democrat, this is a Republican district, the Democrat said that she wasn't going to do that, and she won. So the fact is that the American people can talk all they want about how we ought to cut the deficit, but when it comes down to putting an X in a box, they don't want to do it for the candidate who's really going to make a difference. So I think we're in a tough spot politically in terms of solving these problems.